Okay, so you sent over this really interesting stuff about TSMC, Intel, Samsung. It's the whole world of shrinking transistors, you know? And it seems like everyone's talking about TSMC winning lately, especially with how they're moving into these smaller and smaller nanometer processes for making chips, right? And yet some of their rivals are hitting roadblocks.
It's not just that they're ahead, it's how far ahead they are. We're talking 3 nanometer, even pushing towards 2 nanometer processes, and there's not even the usual talk of production issues.
Yeah, it's like radio silence.
Exactly. In this industry, silence usually means good things.
Right. And then on top of all of that, there's this curveball. We have this inventor, and he's making some pretty bold claims. He thinks his air filtration system, the one he patented, he thinks that's the secret to why TSMC is doing so well.
Oh, wow.
And get this, he claims they're using it without his permission.
Oh, that changes things. If he's right, this could be a huge intellectual property fight, one that could really shake up the entire tech world.
So, to understand what's going on, we have to understand how important clean rooms are for making these chips. I mean, we're talking about transistors billions of times smaller than a hair.
Wow.
Even a speck of dust can ruin everything.
That's right. As we get to these super small sizes, nanometer scales, and just so everyone listening knows, we're talking billions of a meter here, even a tiny particle can completely ruin a chip. And this is where the normal air filters, even the really good HEPA filters, they start to show their limits. Good for everyday use, sure, but not for this kind of precision.
And that's where this guy's system comes in, right? This maze-style air filtration system. He says it's the answer. He says it uses electrostatic charges. And this super complex maze-like structure to basically force the particles to crash into these charged surfaces. He thinks this can almost completely filter the air, even catching those super tiny particles that other systems miss.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. This guy is saying that TSMC's success lines up perfectly with when he shared his patent with them. Years ago, by the way. He sees their success as them using his tech without asking.
Wow.
He wants an investigation.
So we have the inventor's theory, right?
Yeah.
Now let's look at the bigger picture. Intel, for example, they've had a really hard time moving past the 14 nanometer process. They keep having delays with 10 nanometer production, and even 7 nanometer has had issues.
It's weird because Intel has so many resources, right? They're the experts in this, and they have all this history of innovating, but they seem stuck when it comes to getting smaller. And it's not just Intel, Samsung too, putting tons of money in, they've got the smarts. But they've also had problems with yields, and they've even lost customers. It makes you wonder, what's TSMC doing that they aren't?
And this inventor thinks he knows, right? Could his air filter be the thing that's missing for everyone else? He's arguing that TSMC's success is because they figured out how to control these ultrafine particles.
Yeah. His argument really comes down to timing, right? TSMC suddenly becomes the leader. It shakes up the whole industry. And this happens right around the time he shared his patent. It might just be coincidence, but he thinks it's a key part of the story.
Okay, so let's think about this. On one hand, you have this inventor. It's like David versus Goliath, you know? He's seen this massive tech company, one of the biggest in the world, stole his breakthrough idea. But then you have TSMC, a company that everyone knows for being great at making chips. This could be huge. Could this be a legal battle that changes the tech world forever? Or is this all just a bunch of nothing?
It's definitely a big deal. The money involved could be insane, not to mention how it could disrupt everything. This case might show how vulnerable these tech giants are and how much they rely on ideas from outside, especially in areas like this. It makes you ask, how much control do these companies really have, especially when it comes to things that are sort of behind the scenes?
Now, to understand this tech blend, we have to look at how this maze-style thing works. The inventor says it's this labyrinth.
This is where his engineering background really comes in. He goes into how this maze structure, plus these carefully controlled electrostatic charges, makes this trap. It's so effective, it can catch even the tiniest nanoparticles. Think of it like a tiny obstacle course. It's made to catch these particles.
And he even included diagrams in his notes. This guy is serious, he's passionate about this, and he thinks it's revolutionary, right?
Yeah.
He goes into a lot of detail about how it fixes the problems of normal HEPA filters, especially when it comes to catching these ultrafine particles consistently, every time.
And he's not just telling stories, he gets into the science, talking about particle behavior and physics. Things like Brownian motion, and how that makes these tiny particles hard to catch.
This is key. He said the old way is to trap particles in a mesh, but at the nanometer scale, that doesn't work. His maze changes that. It's a better way to catch those ultrafine particles. It's like setting a trap specifically for these little troublemakers.
I like that analogy. It really shows how this tech could change things in all kinds of industries where clean air is really important.
He says it's not just about filtering out the dust we see. He's talking about making an environment so clean that even the smallest particles are captured. Which brings us back to TSMC.
This is where it gets interesting with TSMC. If they're using something similar in their factories, it could explain how they've been making so many chips without problems, even as they're pushing the limits of how small they can go.
Basically, he's saying
Yeah.
they used it to get ahead in this race, this global race for smaller, faster, more powerful chips.
It's David versus Goliath, right? This guy against one of the most powerful tech companies. It's got everything. Cutting-edge tech, maybe corporate espionage, a legal fight that could change the tech world.
And it all comes down to this thing we don't think about much. Clean air. It's like a reminder that even when we're talking about really advanced tech, something simple like air can have a huge impact.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting deep dive so far, looking at air filters and how they connect to making these tiny chips.
And we have a lot of questions. Is this guy right? Could this be true? And what does this say about how competitive the tech world is and how companies try to push technology forward?
Yeah, definitely lots to think about. So let's get into what this inventor is actually saying. He's really sure that his system is better than even those ULPA filters, which are like the best ones for clean rooms.
Yeah, he specifically mentions that those ULPA filters, even the really good ones, the U17 grade, I think he called it, they're only tested for particles down to a certain size, like 0.12 micrometers. But when you're making chips at 14 nanometers,
Yeah.
or even smaller, like 7 or 5 nanometers, that's way tinier.
His point is that even a few of these tiny particles, the ones that get through the normal filters, they could totally mess up production. It's like you're trying to build this tiny, delicate city, and there are sandstorms blowing through.
Yeah, I get it. And he explains that his system works differently. It's not just the filter itself. It uses electrostatic forces in this maze design to basically suck the particles out of the air.
Almost like a tiny vacuum cleaner for particles. And the maze design is important here. By forcing the air through this twisty path, it's more likely that even the smallest particles will hit a charged surface and get trapped.
So it's not just one layer of defense, right? It's like multiple chances to catch those particles, like a security system with tons of checkpoints.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered approach to clean air, made for these really small particles. And that's what makes his claim so interesting, the detail.
So he thinks about everything, huh? He even says, what if the electrostatic force isn't strong enough? He says, just crank up the voltage. Make those maze walls supercharged so the particles stick.
He really knows his physics, and he's not afraid to point out where his design could have problems. But then he gives solutions. It shows he really understands this stuff.
Makes you wonder why everyone's not using this, right, if it's so good. He thinks it's because people don't like change. The industry likes to stick with what it knows, even when there might be a better way.
He might be right. The chip industry is all about avoiding risk, especially with something as important as clean rooms. Change happens slowly.
But we can't forget about how he feels, right? This guy's frustrated. He thinks his idea is being used, and no one is giving him credit.
It's a tough spot to be in.
He feels like he helped start a revolution, and he's been left out.
And he's passionate about this. He thinks it can help people, not just make better chips.
Yeah, it's not just about money and patents for him. He really believes this could make lives better.
He even calls it a longevity machine. He says cleaner air could help us live longer, healthier lives because it would reduce the toxins building up in our bodies.
That's a bold claim. I mean, it might sound crazy, but we can't deny that air quality affects our health.
Right. His point is that even tiny particles, if they build up over time, they can hurt us in ways we don't even realize.
He compares his invention to other big inventions, right? Things that change the world, like maglev trains, fiber optic cables, Tesla's electric motor. All of these are based on simple physics ideas.
He's saying his invention might seem simple, but it could be just as important as those other things.
And he says that being simple is a good thing.
Right, because it's based on fundamental ideas. He says it's hard to copy or improve.
That shows a lot of confidence. He thinks he's found the way to make air almost perfectly clean, and he really wants to see it happen.
And he's really critical of the old ways of filtering air, especially HEPA filters. He gets into how they work. Good for big particles, but they just trap stuff in a mesh.
Yeah, and he points out that when particles get smaller, they can slip through the gaps in the mesh, especially if the air is moving fast. He even talks about Brownian motion, which is how particles randomly move around in fluids.
It's like catching butterflies in a net. Some are going to get away, especially the small ones.
And he says his maze approach fixes this random movement problem. It controls the environment, so the particles are more likely to get caught, no matter their size or how much they're bouncing around.
It's really cool how he uses his own experiences, his science knowledge, and his passion to explain all this.
He even calls out some air purifier companies, saying their marketing is misleading, that they exaggerate how well HEPA filters work, especially for these ultrafine particles.
It's a good reminder to be careful, to do your research.
Right. Especially when it comes to our health.
Yeah.
Not all air purifiers are the same.
He's also worried about those air purifiers that use negative ions.
Yeah, he says they can actually make things worse.
Creating these black ions that are even more harmful to breathe.
So it's like trying to solve a problem, but creating a new one.
Exactly.
And of course, his solution is this maze system, which he thinks doesn't have those problems. But he doesn't stop there. He names names. He talks about TSMC's new factory in Arizona, the one that's going to make some of the most advanced chips in the world. He thinks they're probably using his technology there.
That's a big accusation. Why is he so sure about that factory?
He mentions companies like Hantang and Vanswan. They're the ones building the factory. And they're known for being experts in clean rooms.
So he's putting the pieces together. TSMC's success, his patent, the companies building the factories. It's like he's building a case that TSMC is using his idea without asking.
And he doesn't just call out TSMC. He talks about Intel and Samsung, too.
Yeah.
He says their problems with making smaller chips might be because they can't control these ultrafine particles.
So he's saying his invention is the key to making the next generation of chips. It's the thing that's been holding everyone back.
It's wild to think that this whole industry, worth billions of dollars, might depend on something invented by one guy.
And he goes even further. He mentions Apple, NVIDIA, AMD. He thinks they might be involved too, if they're using chips made with his tech without his permission.
He's not holding back. He's going after the biggest names in tech.
It's a bold move, taking on these huge companies, just because he believes he has something that could change the world.
But does he have any proof? Or is it just all based on timing?
He's asking anyone who knows something to come forward. He wants to expose what he thinks is a huge case of stealing ideas.
He's even offering a reward. A cut of any money he might get from a lawsuit.
It's a big gamble, but it could be a game changer.
He even talks about those confidentiality agreements, the ones people sign at these companies. He says those agreements can't be used to hide illegal stuff or stop people from reporting it.
He's standing up for what he thinks is right, even if it means going against powerful companies.
This guy is something else.
Passionate inventor, fighting for his idea. He thinks he's been cheated. He's using everything he can to get justice.
It raises questions about how we protect new ideas.
Definitely. And about the challenges inventors face, especially in the tech world, where it's so competitive.
And it all comes back to clean air, right? This thing we don't even think about.
Yeah, but it's essential for technology to move forward.
His story shows us that even in the most high-tech fields, something simple can make a huge difference.
It's also about the people behind these inventions, the drive, the passion, the frustration, and the fight for recognition and justice.
This story is far from over. We'll have to see how it all plays out. Maybe we'll have an update for you in the final part of this deep dive. Okay, before we finish up, it's important to remember we've been talking about this inventor's claims and his theory, right? We haven't actually seen proof that TSMC is using his tech without permission.
You're right. It's really important to remember these are just accusations, not proven facts. And TSMC hasn't said anything publicly about this,
Yeah.
We don't want to jump to conclusions or say this is definitely corporate espionage.
Definitely not. This could be a really big deal, and we need to consider every side of it. But even if we ignore the legal stuff for a minute, this story makes you think about how we protect inventions and what inventors have to deal with in this super competitive tech world.
I think what really stood out to me was his concern about those negative ion generators. He seems really worried that companies are exaggerating how good those things are, and people might end up using products that are bad for them.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. It makes you think about responsibility. Companies need to be honest about the tech they're using and how it could affect people.
Right, and people need to do their research before they buy the latest gadget or health product.
It comes down to thinking critically. We're always getting bombarded with info, especially about tech.
Absolutely.
We have to question what we hear, dig deeper, and look at things from different perspectives.
Yeah, be skeptical.
So what have we learned? This deep dive has shown us that even something like air filtration can have a big impact on the tech world.
For sure.
It affects the devices we use, even whole industries.
It reminds us that a lot of innovation happens behind the scenes.
Right, it's the unsung heroes and those small discoveries that end up changing things.
And we need to protect those discoveries, not just for the inventors, but for technology to keep moving forward.
This whole case, no matter what happens, it's a small example of what's happening in tech.
This constant push for smaller, faster, more powerful tech.
Yeah, and the competition.
The fight over who owns what.
It also shows how connected everything is. This one inventor's idea, something as basic as clean air, it can affect how chips are made. And those chips are in everything. Phones, cars, you name it.
That's crazy when you think about it.
This deep dive has been really interesting.
We've learned about cutting-edge technology,
The complicated world of intellectual property, and how important clean air is for all of this. We'd love to hear what you think about all this. What do you think about the future of tech and innovation?
Keep those questions coming.
And stay curious.